Pop the hood of a new car today, and you are greeted by a slab of molded plastic. Everything is sealed, computerized, and entirely impenetrable to the average person. 50 years ago, the mechanics were exposed. You could trace the fuel lines, adjust the ignition timing by ear, and strip a motor down to its base components with a set of basic hand tools. In post-war Sweden, that accessibility was the defining feature of the moped. It was a utilitarian tool for the working man, a cheap, reliable light to get from the city center to a factory or a field. Today, the skills required to keep these 50 to 175cc engines running are disappearing. The generation that spent their weekends in these garages is aging out, and their knowledge of two-stroke nuances is vanishing with them. It's not just the knowledge that's at risk. Original factory repair tools have been discarded or lost, and the aluminum and steel components of the engines themselves are slowly yielding to decades of rust and oxidation. Jim Lundberg, a trained mechanic and technical writer, recognized that this vacuum was forming. He began a mission to preserve this hands-on mechanical culture through a 2-volume manual titled Stora Tvåtaktboken, the Great Two-Stroke Book. Lundberg is driven by vetgiriet, a persistent technical curiosity. Over several decades, he has disassembled and documented 51 distinct vintage engines, recording the exact specifications of their internal workings. These volumes provide a granular record of a repair culture that has never been formally documented. By cataloging the internal architecture of these machines, Lundberg is building a reference library, ensuring that the specific technical data for these engines remains accessible to anyone with a wrench. To understand these machines, you have to look at the traffic they were built to navigate. By the late 1930s, Swedish traffic was becoming chaotic. People were bolting heavy auxiliary motors onto standard bicycle frames, creating improvised vehicles that were often structurally unsound and dangerous in urban traffic. On July 1, 1952, the government stepped in with a new decree formally defining the moped. To keep these vehicles license-free, they had to stay bicycle-like. The law mandated a maximum output of 0.8 horsepower, a top speed of 30 kilometers per hour, and the inclusion of mandatory pedals. That design philosophy lasted until 1961, when a legal reform removed the pedal requirement. This triggered a massive engineering shift. Manufacturers began producing sport moped models with kickstarts and footrests, effectively turning the moped into a miniaturized motorcycle. Because of these laws, every vintage engine Lundberg restores is a literal artifact of Swedish legislation. The engine displacement, the gear ratios, and the frame design were all physically dictated by the state. In the garage, Lundberg turns this history into physical action. He relies on clarigiter, clever, resourceful solutions for mechanical problems that modern manuals don't cover. Consider the problem of a piston that has rusted completely shut inside a cylinder. If you try to hammer it out, the impact will almost certainly shatter the connecting rod, destroying the engine from the inside. Lundberg's solution is a grease gun hack. He threads the gun into the spark plug hole and pumps the space full of grease. This creates immense hydraulic pressure that is distributed evenly across the piston face, safely forcing it downward and breaking the rust seal without a single hammer blow. This DIY approach is a necessity. Since proprietary factory tools from the 1960s no longer exist, Lundberg shows readers how to fabricate their own pullers and testers from scrap steel, allowing them to service tight engine clearances that would otherwise be inaccessible. This is more than just fixing metal. By teaching readers how to think like a mechanic, Lundberg is transferring a tactile feel for the machine, empowering the average person to act as a conservator of their own history. However, all of Jim Lundberg's documentation is only useful if the legal framework allows these machines to exist. A new threat has emerged from the European Union, the End-of-Life Vehicle Directive, or ELV. Under this proposed regulation, aging vehicles or unattached components could be classified as waste if they meet certain environmental criteria. If an engine or chassis is labeled as waste, the owner could lose the legal right to keep it, forcing these machines into scrapyards. The moped hobby is particularly vulnerable because keeping one machine alive almost always requires donor parts from others. If those donors are legally categorized as trash, the entire restoration cycle collapses. Standing against this is the Motorhistorikerriksförbundet, or MHRF. With over 100,000 members, they act as the institutional defense for rolling cultural heritage. The MHRF has secured vital victories for the community, like 40-year inspection exemptions, low-cost vintage insurance, and defining them as cultural artifacts rather than environmental hazards. The survival of this culture depends on a two-front effort. It requires the hands-on pedagogy of mechanics like Jim Lundberg to keep the knowledge alive, and the institutional lobbying of the MHRF to ensure that these machines remain a legal, breathing part of the landscape.